spent 35 years at the United Nations. I am the co-chair of the faith-based organizations for crime prevention and criminal justice, which we started last year at the UN Crime Commission. And we've had a series of live meetings, one in the Cathedral of St. Stephen in Vienna, and another one in San Francisco at the Christchurch Cathedral. I think we're going to mix up the order a little bit because our main speaker has not yet arrived online. And I would like to introduce my good friend Harold Egera, who jumped in at the last minute to speak about the Faith for Earth initiative of UNEP. UNEP is the major organization which is promoting World Environment Day tomorrow. And we'd certainly like to hear from Harold. And perhaps Harold can also mention a sentence or two the work that he does with mountains and rivers, because those are the two big elements in our environment. And also what I remember from your project, you were very big on intergenerational knowledge sharing. And so I give you now 5-6 minutes, okay? Harold, please, can we unmute?
Okay. Yes, I will try. Very good. Thank you very much, Michael, and greetings to everybody. It's a big pleasure and honor for me to be here on behalf of the United Nations Environment Program. As Michael already has said, that tomorrow is World Environment Day that celebrates, in fact, the foundation of the global environmental movement in the early 70s. And this year of World Environment Day is about nature and how we deal with nature and how we should go back to nature and what nature gives us in return. And all this, of course, in very important times of us living as humanity in a global biodiversity crisis. We are now also in another crisis, which is a health crisis. We see many of the, we saw the curves about COVID in Austria. They have managed to flatten this curve of infections. But we know that we have a lot of other curves to flatten that probably will be not that easy to flatten. We cannot do a lockdown against climate change or against the biodiversity crisis. But of course, we will need to change our way and views, in fact, how we deal with the earth and how we look at reality. Myself, I am, as Michael has said, I'm not a specialist for the topic of faith and environment. I'm going to deliver a little presentation on behalf of Iyad Abou-Mogli, who is the director of the Faith for Earth strategy in UNEP. Just as you said, myself, we are working in Eastern Europe mainly, and also on the global mountain ecosystems. We believe that mountains and rivers and ecosystems need to function. And we have one initiative that is called the Carpathian Convention. That's a beautiful mountain range that extends over 7 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where we are managing basically an environmental convention, a regional environmental treaty to keep and to sustainably develop that area. And I think it's a beautiful exercise of all different stakeholders working together. As Michael said, we have a lot of activities on environmental education, but also a very strong collaboration with science and a lot of cooperation with the civil society organizations of all types. And I have already said I'm not a specialist on faith and science and environment, but I was lucky that I joined the so-called Symposium 2 that was organized by the Patriarch Bartholomeus, who has been organizing all these interreligious symposia on the Aegean Sea, on the Black Sea, on the Danube, then later even in the Arctic or on the Amazon River, that brought really together the people. And I believe that today, when I go to Romania, for example, and we do our work as UNEP there, there is something with the people. The people, they love the nature, they love environment. There are very many people committed to the cause. And I believe that this is the result maybe already of this work 10 or 15 years ago that was also engaging with the faith-based organizations, because it's obviously a very good way to bring important subject close to the people. So that was my personal introduction. I will now move to my to the presentation to tell you what UNEP is doing on the global scale on this topic. And I will try to share my screen. And I hope it's worked out. So I'm gonna speak on Faith for Earth, the UNEP strategic engagement with faith-based organizations, which started in 2017, practically 2 years after adoption of the SDGs, and is a global strategy for engagement with faith-based organizations promoted by the United Nations Environment Programme. And when we talk about implementation of the SDGs, we talk about the 5 Ps, which are the key principles to make this SDGs a reality. We have to deal with the people, ensure more prosperity, to protect our planet, and to engage in partnerships in a peaceful way. How can we implement the SDGs? The governments cannot do it alone to achieve 2030 agenda. Really, all stakeholders have to be there. The private sector is contributing. Civil society organizations are contributing. But in the beginning, the faith-based organizations were not an integral part of the implementation mechanism of this Agenda 2030. Even so, they have a big role to play, and they always have played a big role in achieving sustainable development. So the focus of the initiative and of the strategy is to integrate the faith-based organizations as an implementing partner. And why? Our rationale is because many people associate, or the vast majority of people of this planet associate themselves with a religion. There are many of these organizations around the world. They are operational, they are on the ground. It influences the lifestyles of the people, and so on. So also the faith-based organizations, they are holding enormous assets. And just to demonstrate this role, we say that they own 8% of habitable land. They are involved in 50% of the schools worldwide. They, for example, own 5% of all commercial forests worldwide. I think in Austria it's 17%. Involved in 65% of schools in the sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see other of these impressive figures there. So why they are such an important player also in economic terms. Our mission is to engage the faith-based organizations in action for the 2030 agenda. We want to provide an interface platform for them to contribute and maximize the impact also within the UN systems, with the vision that there is a world where all creations can live in balance, and not only humans subordinating and controlling the resources of the earth. There are different strategic goals. The first goal is dialogue with faith leaders on policy, again to bring faith leaders into discussions also and decision making also in the UN system. As already said, faith-based organizations are the 4th largest economic power on earth, so also greening their investments and greening their own operations, and last but not least, to bridge the gap between the scientific evidence for example, what international organizations are saying with the theology and the religious scripts and what they are saying, so that also would allow to empower faith leaders to underpin their messages and to underpin faith messages also with scientific evidence. One example of those is the work that UNEP has been underdoing to basically to bring together the Sustainable Development Goals and Laudatio Si of Pope Francis, that was already mentioned in the introduction of this call. So that is one of the examples we have been doing. I'm not going to go into the details here, just to mention it. And also, what does it mean? So our initiative, we know we have 17 SDGs. We have 169 targets. We have 202 indicators. So how to integrate this with environmental matters and in the framework of engaging also with faith-based organizations. We focus in ourselves on the green SDGs. That would mean the 6 to 7 SDGs that contribute directly to the health of the planet. There's one of them, for example, natural resource management. I will come back to it. But of course, all of these, again, not only contribute to the health of the planet, but also to the other important principles of sustainable development and of the SDGs. We have come up with a set of guiding principles for how to do that for leaders and faith-based organizations. And then we try to connect them to the existing programs and initiatives that are existing within UNEP. One example is the SDG 12 on sustainable production and consumption that I was showing. Why? Because religions very strongly say, some people say they dictate what people can eat, what they can drink, or what they can dress. They influence a whole lifestyle system. So therefore, this is also basically closely tied to how human beings behave, and therefore to the sustainable production and consumption and goals. So that's the global picture. But also there are 36 million churches around the world, which is important. So one could also basically engage, or we are engaging to make the ecological footprint of churches better, install solar panels, and so on. Also, there was the idea of green pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is very important in all religions. Hundreds of millions of people are each year on spiritual journeys or visits, and there are important concepts of how to make this activity contribute to let's say to a good environmental performance.
Okay. I think you've reached your time limit.
Okay, I'm almost done. So I will skip them very quickly. So the same, I could tell you this, I'm not going to go into details anymore. The same we could say about water, about cities, about climate change, life underwater, or life above water. In all of those, this cooperation is very important. I want to finish to say that we are now living the post-COVID sign. We say as an organization that this should be a moment to reflect of what nature wants to tell us and to show us also its limits. And I think they are giving us a very important message. And with this, I want to conclude again. I thank you very much for your attention. I was in danger to run over time. I shorten it now, but thank you very much for your attention. And I hope together this discussion will find us and help us to find a different way to look at the reality. And I wish you a successful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harold. That was a wonderful overview. That's a great introduction. I think you have probably done this as good as Professor Sachs would have done. So Uh, can I ask Kiran Bari to come
It
up?
is sorry, it's Jeff
Oh,
Sachs here.
oh, Jeff. Have you
Yeah,
been listening? Have you been listening?
I was, yes. I'm sorry I was not able to connect initially with the link. I had to restart my computer. That was the problem.
So you understand where we are now.
I do.
We have UNEP have spoken for 15 minutes, and they've basically described the UN's efforts to meet the goals, and also discussed tomorrow's Environment Day. So now we'd like you to speak as you wish.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I missed the UNEP presentation, but I heard Harold's wonderful presentation just now. And I just wanted to make a couple of points about the religious engagement that I have found to be important and I hope useful. The first is that I think the major religions, many of them need help to understand the nature of this crisis. The will is there. The knowledge and understanding of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the other challenges we're facing requires technical knowledge, and many leaders of many faiths are asking for help in that. I've had nothing but wonderful and inspiring experience over the last decade with the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences at the Vatican, which we should understand is a unique institution in the world, an institution of leading scientists from many faiths that come together to help advise the Catholic Church and the Pope on the detailed science that underpins many of our challenges. I find it an absolutely extraordinary and remarkable undertaking, and have participated in, I think, dozens of conferences at this point over the course of a decade. Laudato Si, which is an astoundingly important, eloquent, knowledgeable, persuasive encyclical, draws upon the scientific knowledge that has been brought together by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. The point I want to make is that other major faiths generally do not have such an instrument at their benefit. And one thing I hope that we could think about doing is providing such assistance or providing avenues for such technical interchange. At the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, many theological and religious leaders from Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, various Christian denominations, Judaism, and others have come together as part of these gatherings. And I have discussed with these leaders the idea of these various world-leading faiths making similar efforts to gather the systematic scientific knowledge that is extremely useful and important in their religious faith and social work that Harold was just speaking about. So this is the first point that I wanted to put on the table. I've spoken to Patriarch Bartholomew about the opportunities for the Orthodox faiths to engage the scientists in the Orthodox regions. I've spoken to leaders in many Asian countries about similar opportunities. And I believe that this would be a big help. Watching the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences working is a profound inspiration for me, and a demonstration of how the worlds of faith and science can be brought together in such an incredibly fruitful and powerful way. And I think Laudato Si is an exemplar of that. The second quick point that I wanted to make is along the same lines. My feeling and hope is that while the various world religions and faiths, of course, have their own deep commitments and very different commitments, there is an underpinning of common ethics that can be drawn upon to find a common language across all the faiths. I've been helping in an initiative called Ethics in Action with the Vatican and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which aimed specifically to bring together religious leaders to discern the commonalities, of course, as well as the differences. It's not to smooth over or to be glib or to be naive about all agreements, but it is to say that there is a common underpinning of ethics, a view of human beings as dignity as a fundamental part of humanity, of their humanity, that is common to all the faiths. And my belief is that if we can find that common language, we will be doing the world a great favor right now. I live in a country, by the way, tearing itself apart these days because we have a leader whose power is through division and fear, and he's creating a vast crisis in our country and in the world. But he tries to pit the faiths against each other also. The evangelical Christian faith against other faiths. It's ugly, it's dangerous, it's not the first time in history, and it's something that we need to resist also. So my second point is that in addition to the scientific knowledge, we make special increased efforts to find the commonality of human dignity and human rights that underpin the SDGs and underpin our common agenda. It is plain to say, but important to indicate, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a core document that has been adopted by all countries of the world. It was actually created by a group of scholar diplomats from many different faiths and geographies, and so it reflects a very ecumenical perspective. But we really need this now also. And so I would point to at least 3 such initiatives that I know of that I think we should support. One is the Alliance of Civilizations of the United Nations, led by Miguel Moratinos, which aims precisely to avoid the conflict of civilizations and all of the stereotypes and ugliness that goes along with this. Second is the great global NGO Religions for Peace, which is another ecumenical gathering of religious leaders specifically to find those commonalities. And the third wonderful group that I have been lucky to be part of in many occasions in the last 10 years is the Community San Egidio, which is a faith-based group in Rome, closely affiliated with the Vatican, but whose core mission is peace and cross-religion dialogue and understanding. And so these are the 2 main points that I would like to add to help religious leaders and leaders in the community to understand the challenges substantively, deeply, scientifically, with the knowledge that can really empower them to empower their congregants. And second, to find stronger ways to work across the faiths so that all of humanity can be reassured that there is a common vision. This is not faith against faith. It's the last thing that we want, need, or is the truth, that there is a common core of based on human dignity and on virtue that is common to all of the world's major religions that we can draw upon to have the religions play the vital role that they need to play at this time. So thank you very much for the chance to just share a couple of thoughts with you. I do have to run, unfortunately, because our world today is a Zoom to Zoom to Zoom world. And I, unfortunately, am not going to be able to participate in the rest of the discussion. But back to you.
Can I just ask you one question, which actually I had sent to your assistant? You're basically a cheerleader for Pope Francis. You've been called that and been promoting Laudato Si. But Wikipedia says you were born into a Jewish family. And to what extent does your religion, I don't know whether that's Jewish or Catholic,
Yep.
Lead you to some form of solidarity with the poor people or the ethical foundations of economics? Where does your faith lead to policy?
Well, in the Jewish faith, the notion of justice is absolutely at the core. And you can't be raised in a Jewish community, as I was, not a highly observant one, but a cultural community, without being totally imbued with the idea of social justice. Absolutely at the core. There's one of the great injunctions of the Bible is tzedek, tzedek, tzedek tirdok, justice, justice shall you pursue. And this is absolutely at the core of Jewish teaching. I think it's at the core of religious wisdom and teaching and Christian teaching. It is very, very easy for me to be cheerleader, if you say, for Pope Francis, because I think he is our most important and wonderful moral leader in the world, and an absolutely fantastic figure. But the ethics of Catholic social teachings are very, very congenial and harmonious to me. Though I'm of a different faith, I don't find any gaps. I find this extraordinarily important. Two other things I would mention. One is that in Jewish faith or Jewish tradition, there's a doctrine called Tikkun Olam, which is to heal the breaks in the universe, to heal the wounds of the universe. So you're put a pretty heavy guilt trip from early on that you should be doing something good to heal the wounds of the universe. And I think it's a wonderful way to instill meaning in life. I know, at least introspectively, it's been probably the most important idea for me in my life, in my professional life. And the second point I just wanted to add is that a great deal of my thinking is actually, I would say, Aristotelian and based on the Greek philosophy of virtue as being the essence of a good society. Of course, Aristotle and Aristotelian thinking is a core of the church's social teachings through Thomism. And so I find this also extremely central and vital, that Aristotle's teachings about the purpose of politics as being human well-being and the purpose of life as being the search for well-being through virtue is something that is, quote, pagan philosophy, but core to religious philosophy also. Very wise, very important, and also, I believe, a common language, because of all of the various dimensions of ethics, I'm more particular to virtue ethics, that ethics is about well-being, and well-being is found through the cultivation of virtue. more than Kantian deontological ethics, which is do this, do that because you have to. At the core, they're not so different, but I prefer the search for well-being through virtue as the way to proceed. But Aquinas pointed out that this is both the Christian, I would say Jewish, and Aristotelian thinking all wrapped into one. So I find it a very congenial way to proceed.
Great, thank you very much. We know you're a distinguished economist. We didn't know that you were a philosopher theologian. So
how can you do economics? This is what Aristotle taught us. Economics is part of moral philosophy, after all. We have to work on that.
Okay, let's let you run to your next.
Thank you for including me. I really appreciate it.
You made a tremendous impression on us all. So you
Wonderful.
will be followed now by a Hindi lady. So we're continuing in this
Fantastic.
thought patterns. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Kiran, I think you follow nicely now with
Thank you.
Can you?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
If this lady is a judge, who cares a lot about social justice, compassion, equity, and creating a safer, healthier, stronger, inclusive communities. And she is the global chair of the world's largest interfaith grassroots network. So I think following what we just talked about, you're excellent.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this important webinar, especially in the run-up to World Environment Day tomorrow. All of our religions, all of our spiritual expressions and our indigenous traditions highlight the importance of environmental stewardship. And they highlight the importance of protecting Mother Earth. Earth is referred to as the Divine Mother. So in a world where 8 in 10 people are identifying with a particular faith tradition, we can understand the power that has. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how the faith and the interfaith communities have transformed their commitment towards environmental justice. The work is happening. We have converted dialogue to action. From an interfaith perspective, over the many years that I've been involved, I've seen communities coming together to work for peace. Now, that was usually peace, meaning an absence of violence, peace between human beings, and that was it. There was very little reference to peace being about the environment, peace being about all living beings, not just humans. And so I'm pleased to say that things are changing for the better. Faith communities and the interfaith community have taken the bull by the horns and have really embedded the idea of peace for the environment into this overall concept of peace in our world. And that's because we've had some really good awareness raising. We have seen changes visibly in our environment that affects our day-to-day life. And the potential of the faith community is just huge. There are so many communities on the ground who have resources, who are united by a set of values, and indeed they listen to each other, and they are seen as the change makers in the community. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. The United Religions Initiative, the world's largest interfaith network in the world, is operating in 108 countries. And one of the important things about this interfaith-based network is the ability to change behaviors. Why should we change behaviors? Because the climate change and the issues that we are experiencing today are about people's behavior. Our behavior has created a problem, but at the same time, our behavior can help to reverse the issues. So number one, seeing the divinity in our environment, that's what all of our faiths, traditions, indigenous traditions talk about. They talk about caring. But the power of faith is helping us to create a better behavior and to embrace this message of creating a sustainable environment, especially for the next generation. And so climate change is not just about using our cars, or using less water. There's other things connected to our livelihood, such as the agriculture, our eating habits. Let's just look at the environment during lockdown. We've seen less air pollution, clearer waters, plants are growing better, the wildlife is more liberated. And I think it's so important we reflect on this and allow our natural world the chance to adapt and thrive in the absence of all of this human interaction that goes on, which is very much destroying the world. I want to stress that all of our teachings talk about care and compassion, but we must extend that to all living beings. Look at our wildlife, how they've been affected by climate change. And sometimes, you know, because we can't hear their voice, we need to be their voice. So in URI, we are doing so much change at the community level, at the grassroots level, around compassion for animals, planting trees, education and awareness. And indeed, the role of faith leaders is so important in that, because they hold a lot of respect and they can encourage us to, or inspire us to stay at home, work from home, to connect and think about this moral compass. Education, important for everyone, so that we understand what it is that we can do. So how we then translate all this listening into dialogue and specific actions. And an example would be tying it in with a particular festival. So Christmas, how can we utilize a special festival such as Christmas to talk about climate change? Well, just recently, there was a nice gathering going on, and Santa, somebody dressed up as Santa, and for the children especially, the message was, well, you know what, Santa may not have a home to go back to because the ice is melting. Now that will touch the children, but for us as adults, does Christmas really need to be about consumerism? Think of all the waste that goes on. So there's a number of creative ways that we can utilize to help people understand what it is they can do. I'm going to conclude with just one example of how faith communities have worked with the wider bodies. So here in the UK, as an interfaith cooperation circle, as part of United Religions Initiative, we have worked with many different bodies, Friends of the Earth, for example, and other community bodies to lobby the local council, those decision makers, those policy makers, to take urgent action to improve and protect our environment. So we all know about the greenhouse gases and the carbon dioxide trapping the heat, which is warming the globe. But what are we going to do about it? So after immense lobbying, we worked to ensure that a climate emergency was passed. So the local body, civic body, passed a declaration of a climate emergency, and that was a really huge milestone in the whole partnership that we had. But that didn't mean anything on its own. It created publicity, but what did that actually mean? So the good thing is that we have worked together to create a vision. The vision is to ensure that our area here is completely carbon neutral by 2038. Carbon emissions from human activities will need to be dramatically reduced to zero. And how will we do this? Well, first of all, set a carbon budget, ensure that we achieve our net zero ambition, increase the amount of vehicle charging points for electric vehicles, encouraging the use of electric cars, ensuring that low emission cars park for free, adding more electric vehicles to the fleet of the council, giving more young people a voice, organising a youth climate summit where we hear the passionate voices of the young people, and ensure that all decisions, when they are made, we look at the environmental impact. So we look at planting more trees, we have a climate commission created, a green charter, and we increase our recycling rates. So all these are important things that are happening now with milestones, so they are measurable, and we can make sure that we are making progress. That's the important thing. You know, we learn so much, but the important thing is now the action. How do we transform dialogue into action? And I would just like to say the work is happening around the world, our faith communities, our cooperation circles, bringing people together to make that change on the ground. That's something that we can all learn from and we can all be inspired from. And I think as we mark World Environment Day tomorrow, it's so important, but indeed we must live World Environment Day each day and every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate this broad overview. I just wanted to introduce the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, where we have tool kits from the Islamic perspective, from the Hindu's perspective, from the Catholic perspective, Protestant perspective. Unfortunately, we couldn't have anyone join us, but there is someone up there, and I don't see him visually, Jorge Rijos, who was my colleague for many, many years, who was quietly working for many years to save the rainforest and protect wildlife. So Jorge, are you there? Jorge Rijos, we saw you once.
Where is it?
Ah, Ken. Jorge.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry. I went into the non-video mode and it messed everything up. Apologies.
No problems, but now you've got the floor, and you maybe have heard Professor Sachs speak and Kiran Bali, so you have an idea of where we're coming from. I'm so proud that my old UNODC has now joined this group, and faith-based organizations for crime prevention. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And after listening to Kiran and to the professor, I'm asking myself, what are we doing here? This seems to be a lot to do with theology and faith, religion, etc. And as you know, our work is a little different, yeah. But I think it's all interconnected. So maybe that's why we're here. And also a big hello to my friend Harold. Let me just say that we're very excited to talk about environmental justice, because this ultimately is something that affects all of us, or the lack of environmental justice. And the juxtaposition of faith and environment for me was very, very, very interesting, yeah, in the lead up to this. So let me just say that I think everybody in the Global Program for Wildlife and Timber and Fisheries Crime has faith that we're going to do the right thing ultimately to save what ultimately sustains us all. But Michael, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the UN Office on Drugs and Crime does to address wildlife, timber, and fisheries crime, which I think very nicely complements what Kiran was talking about. Let me just say that biodiversity loss clearly is one of the most serious environmental threats alongside climate change. These are huge issues, and without sustaining the health of both the oceans and the terrestrial ecosystems, we're basically not going to be able to meet the goals and targets of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And that is something that I think we're all very anxious to get working on and to start achieving. However, it's important to lay a little bit of the background with respect to what we all need to understand as being a basis, at least what is the foundation for the work of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And that is the organized and transnational organized crime nature of wildlife, timber, and fisheries that continue to greatly profit from natural resources that should be benefiting populations and communities. Now, we've read over the last several years, very interesting reports. We have the WWF report from a couple of years ago, which left us all in awe, recognizing that we've lost, our planet has lost 50-some%, 52% of its wildlife over the last 40 years. And that's only with, I'm sure, with what we can measure. Just last Tuesday, we have the report from the Global Forest Watch, which again was very, very alarming, saying that we've lost 11.9 million hectares of tree cover, 3.8 of that being tropical primary forests. And this is very, very important, because these really are, the lungs of the earth, as many people call it. And the 3.8 million, according to Global Forest Watch, equates to about 1 football pitch, or for my American friends, one soccer field size of loss of this tropical forest every 6 seconds. And everybody can visualize a soccer field or a football pitch. That's a whole lot every 6 seconds. Also important to note is, about 50% of the timber that is used in some areas is provided by the illegal logging, illegal forestry sector. 1/3 of our global fish catch comes from IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And that's very important to note because, that really sustains so many people around the earth, around our planet with respect to nutrition. And the question that we ask is just when are we going to break, biodiversity's back? When is too much just too much? And all of this really, the confluence here is that without addressing the criminal aspect, the trafficking, the poaching, the corruption, the economic crimes, all the efforts undertaken by everybody will be seriously undermined, and we will not reach our goals and targets. Actually, aside from not reaching our goals and targets, we're all going to be in serious trouble. So one of the first takeaways that I'd really like my presentation to leave with everyone that's joining us is that unless the global community, the political community, member states mainstream criminal justice systems into their policy and programs to protect biodiversity and address climate change, we're simply, all of these efforts are going to fail. It's all linked. We have to include criminal justice considerations when we talk about conservation, management, etc. Corruption is such a huge facilitator. It's a huge issue that unfortunately we fail to tackle appropriately. I've shared my presentation here on the screen with you, and just quickly, I want to just emphasize some of the impacts that we note from wildlife, forest, and fisheries crime. It covers the issues of environment, development, insecurity, but we know that the environment, it clearly decimates our wild flora and fauna. We see that all the time. As I was saying, it severely impacts climate change into biodiversity loss, and these are, thank goodness, issues that the international community is now starting to recognize. The importance of addressing all of these as being interlinked. It undermines development, social and economic development. It's robbed communities of their natural resources, what ultimately should be sustaining them, either with livelihoods or with nutrition, etc. And on the security side, clearly it undermines the rule of law. In some cases, it destabilizes governments, it empowers criminals, and as we know, crime of convergence, it also fuels other crimes. So these are just some of the main issues, but I think they're important enough that we all have to recognize them. Now, what does UNODC do? Well, we're the guardians of the two conventions, the Palermo and the Merida Conventions, otherwise known as the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the Convention Against Corruption. And we, as you know, Michael, at UNODC now include this as one of our main points of work with relation to serious crime types, alongside drug trafficking, arms trafficking, the trafficking in persons, et cetera, et cetera. So we at UNODC take it very, very seriously. We've, over the years, managed to consolidate our work. We started about 2008, just kind of doing a variety of things linked to the issue, but we've come to focus on what can be visualized or characterized as working from crime scene to court. This really is where we feel we have the mandate to do a lot of our work, and we have the tools and instruments to do a lot of this work. We start with the prevention, and if we can't provide member states, if we can't prevent the crime, then we look to interdict, clearly following up on investigations, working with the prosecution and the judiciary, all the way through the courts, to the court system. This really is our flowchart of a lot of the work that we do with member states. And next to the flowchart, you'll see some of our publications. They're either instruments, they're toolkits, they're guides. They're very much substance-oriented instruments that member states can use to to improve the way they address wildlife, timber, and forestry crime. The second takeaway from this slide is that we need, perhaps not us, but member states really need to start considering to make wildlife, these crimes, serious crimes under the definition of the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. You know, they need to be serious crimes within their legislation. If member states fail to do this, you know, simply depending on forestry legislation, hunting legislation, management legislation, you know, legislation that used to cover all of these issues is insufficient. Today, the trafficking, the modality of trafficking, the involvement of transnational organized criminal syndicates is such that, you know, these older laws just are unable to address the intricacies of how this crime type operates. So my next, you know, slide focuses a little bit on partnerships. We are very, very much aware that we cannot work in isolation. This is not only an enforcement-oriented, it shouldn't be only enforcement-oriented, but we need to also include the issues of management, conservation. You know, all of these things need to work together. You know, just like in other crime types, we need to look at livelihoods, we need to look at the supply, and we need to look at the demand. We work very closely with our member states. As you know, the UN does not just go in and do what it wants. It works at the request of member states. And we have very good working relationships with almost all member states, and our work is global. We also work very closely with UN agencies, other international organizations, non-governmental organizations, the conservation community, academics, and the private sector. So we've tried to build a coalition, or at least complement all the work that most of these, you know, agencies or institutions or groups do. We also work very closely with our partners in the International Consortium to Combat Wildlife Crime, which is a very important group of agencies, the World Bank, Interpol, WCO, and the CITES Secretariat, working together really to leverage our best practices and try to bring all of these to bear against the fight against organized to wildlife and forest crime. Very important, and following on what our Secretary General has asked all of the UN agencies to do, is to work together, to avoid duplication, to leverage best practices, to complement our work, and to really better utilize the scarce resources that is really allocated to tackling you know, these environmental crimes. And in that vein, we work very closely with UN Environment. We work closely with FAO, with UNESCO, with UNICEF, with UNDP, to name a few. So we ensure that we consolidate our work and then we complement. I know in the past, you know, some may see that we duplicate work, but I think slowly all the agencies are coming to understand that together we can really make a difference. And for us, you know, when you asked us to join a faith-based organization program, we were scratching our heads, how best can we, you know, support this? And we're very, very much aware that faith-based organizations have a big role to play in sustainably addressing these environmental crimes. And we know that the large number of faith-based organizations work globally, regionally, locally, and that is clearly an advantage for all of us. And I think Professor Sachs very, very well summed it up, just how important they are, just how important the issue is, regardless of your faith and religion, of addressing the issues to ensure that our nature is healthy, and understanding that we also need to be virtuous in the way that we have a relationship with our environment. Let me just close by saying that, you know, this is my first day back in the office, actually, because of COVID-19. And this is just an example of the encroachment, you know, the pandemic, the encroachment into natural frontiers by humans, encroaching also on forests, poaching, taking wildlife, and how all of that really impacts all of us. The human-wildlife interactions, you know, that are now happening at a scale and proximity that never really happened before. And that's enabled these pathogens formerly exclusive to wildlife now to, you know, impact human health. So human health is clearly impacted, clearly linked to a safe and healthy environment, And I think we all need to recognize that we really need to tread carefully in that vein. The last takeaway from my presentation for everyone who may be listening is that, you know, this is another one of the crime types that we deal with globally. We know how to deal with drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking. We have the instruments, we have the tools, we have the knowledge, and for law, you know, police, enforcement folks, they know what to do. Unfortunately, this is a question we need to ask ourselves, is why isn't all of this being used to address wildlife, timber, and fisheries crime? Yeah, I mean, this is just as important for all of us to address. So I feel that we're, you know, at UNODC, we're using all of these tools, but member states need to know that we don't need to reinvent anything. We have the conventions, we have the tools. Let's use them to address this crime. Lastly, we recognize we're all in this together. You know, unless we work together and see this as a mutual challenge, I'm afraid that we're not going to reach our objectives, which is ultimately to ensure that we all live in harmony with our nature. Thank you very much. That's all I had to say.
Great, thank you very much, but I'm not going to let you go so easily. You were saying all sorts of nice things, but well, first of all, Jorge was a lone ranger fighting these crimes when I knew him 10, 20 years ago. But it seems like we're losing what in other cases, I say, this territory the size of Austria every year. It doesn't seem to me that all of our efforts are doing much. And even you didn't really mention the indigenous population that's being thrown into poverty, to sickness, etc. Can you point to anything that really is improving in the last 20 years? Have we done anything that makes a difference in people's lives or in the environment? And you say you get along with all the countries. Well, what about Brazil? What about the Amazon basin, the Congo and the Indonesia, which are real, I think, criminals, we can easily say, in terms of facilitating the theft of timber. So can you just respond to me and give me some hopeful, positive developments since you've been at the office there? Sure.
Thanks, Michael. And, you know, I didn't mean to say all the nice things about this because, you know, there's so many negative things in this crime. Yeah. There's so much corruption. There is so much turning a blind eye. There is so little recognition of just how much these crimes are linked to other crimes. However, you know, over the last several years, we've seen a big shift in the way member states address wildlife, timber, and fisheries crime. Yeah, let's not put things under the table here. These crimes are low profit, high profit, you know, low risk crimes for the criminal, and it generates so much money, and it's linked so much to corruption. I mean, you know, timber and fisheries crime, for the most part, are white-collar crimes. Yeah, wildlife crime, not so much, but timbers and fisheries that have legal, in the end, have legal markets, is very much linked to white-collar crime. You know, and we know how difficult that is to address. You know, so you mentioned Indonesia, the Amazon, yeah. Areas of DRC. I mean, these are clearly areas that are in need of big changes, big political changes, big decisions on the part of those who make decisions. The fact that the EU now has a Green Deal, the fact that the EU is now mainstreaming environmental security into their programming, you know, is a big change. The fact that, you know, donors are now ensuring that that the recipients of donor aid have a certain level of environmental responsibility, whereas before this didn't really happen, is very, very important. You know, we've seen donors put $100 million into preserve forests and then take it back because of corruption, not just leave it there. You know, that's unheard of. That's the way it needs to work. I'm not going to say that it's working perfectly now, because, you know, these crimes, again, they've been seen as emerging crimes. That's number one, Michael. You know, when we worked together, this was always seen as an emerging crime. On our agenda, it was 7th past the 10th, you know, and by the way, there's this emerging crime. Well, it's one of the most, I would say, mature crimes out there. This has been going on for years, but it's a crime, you know, you can't just, these are finite commodities. So it's not like cannabis, coca, you know, the poppy that you can just grow year after year. Once this is over, that's it. And I think we're slowly coming to recognize that being a finite commodity, being a natural resource, being something linked that's ultimately linked to our preservation as a human, as humans, we need to do something. So, you know, the indigenous populations, yeah, they pay a big price. You know, I mean, bushmeat, you know, is a big issue for them, for nutrition. We have to recognize indigenous rights, but we also have to recognize that we can't let, you know, unscrupulous corporations or individuals go and encroach on these areas. But this is exactly what the problem is. So our job is to try to do our best and work with member states. When I said we work well with a lot of member states, we do. But as you know, Michael, member states have, sometimes there's different points of view in a member state, or there's different statements made in a member state. So we try to do what we can, and I can say that we've seen a political shift in how this is seen as an important issue to address. Yeah, not only for managing wildlife, but also for livelihoods, yeah, for GDP. You know, this is a big earner. Wildlife tourism is big. We're seeing that in COVID-19. People aren't going to the park. The rangers aren't being paid. There's increased poaching. This is, you know, this is all very important. So I'll stop there, Michael, but thank you very much for that question.
No, thank you for keeping at it. And it's amazing what you've accomplished in the 10 years since last dealt with you. Great. Now we have one more speaker. Roberto, are you ready to deliver well, let me introduce him briefly. First of all, he's a friend of the Pope, okay? He is a professor of criminal law at the University of Buenos Aires, and he has been involved with several of the events in Rome, the Laudato Si that we've been talking about, also the Amazon Synod that was organized, and most recently also a document which talks about ecological sin, which I found very interesting. So I'm going to let Roberto, Professor Carles speak now, and we'll probably have many questions. But I think it's you can also reflect on all the things that you have heard this afternoon. We don't hear him. I don't hear him.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, now we hear you.
Okay, good afternoon again. I want to thank you all for organizing this meeting and for inviting me to participate. Well, I would like, in the short time I have, to share with you some considerations regarding the possible inclusion of ecocide as an international crime and the position assumed recently by Pope Francis that is part of the magisterium and the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. In his encyclical Laudato Si that was quoted today, the Pope points out, quoting the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I, that to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation for human beings, to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth, waters, its land, its air, and its life, these are sins. He closes that statement by holding that to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. Recently, on the occasion of the 20th Congress of the International Association of Penal Law, the Pope states that the Church is studying the inclusion in the Catechism of ecological sin against the common home. He recalled that the Synod Fathers of the Pan-Amazon region proposed to define ecological sin as action or omission against God, against one's neighbor, the community and the environment. In that occasion, the Pope stated that this is a sin against future generation and is manifested in acts and habits of pollution and destruction of the harmony of the environment, in transgressions against the principles of interdependence, and in the breaking of networks of solidarity between creatures. On that occasion, however, he went beyond theology. Resuming some concepts expressed in our work, he defended the importance of recognition of the crime of ecocide at the international level. He argued that ecocide is to be understood as the loss, damage, or destruction of the ecosystems of a given territory, so that its utilization by inhabitants has been or can be seen as severely compromised. He argued, according to what I proposed in that Congress, that ecocide should be considered the fifth category of crimes against peace, which should be recognized as such by the international community. On that occasion, the Pope appealed to all the leaders and actors in this area to contribute their efforts to ensure adequate legal protection for our common home. So what is the current situation from the point of view of the legal protection of the environment? Something has been said before, but let me say that in the Pope point of view, despite the different environmental conventions, a regime of international environmental criminal law does not yet exist, and international treaties continue to rely on national institutions and courts for their enforcement, leading to a fragmented effort diluted by the differences in individual states' discretion. As we all know, environmental damage is a global threat. Greenhouse emissions in the north pollute the south. The consequences of forest fires transcend borders. Sea levels rise and temperatures rise without distinguishing borders. This reality, as well as the disparity of forces of the nations, impose the need to generate some response to these harmful offenses with punitive and deterrent capacity. One possibility, long discussed, could be the incorporation of the crime of ecocide as a crime against peace, prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, or the creation of an international environmental court more oriented to the prevention and reparation of damage where possible. The inclusion of ecocide as the fifth crime against peace has the difficulties of any legal definition. It is discussed whether it should be strict liability offenses, about the problems surrounding causation, the lack of jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over states and corporations, and even whether if this court is an appropriate forum to preserve our planet. As was the case with genocide in its days, it will be a decision of world leaders how to define ecocide, and the juries will then comment on it, as we usually do. In my opinion, the mass destruction of the environment has enough entity to be considered a crime against peace. However, I believe that for another type of damage to the environment, a supranational structure should be created to respond to these facts under the paradigm of restorative justice, reparation for victims, and prevention for the future. As part of these efforts, I would like to announce today here the creation of the Laudato Si Foundation that was inspired by Pope Francis and will have as its general objective to promote the magisterium of the Pope and to preserve his legacy. In particular, the foundation will develop research and intervention projects for human sustainable and integral development, environmental preservation, and contrast to climate change. The Pope supports this initiative and entrusted its realization to me and Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, whom he met for his commitment to the universal abolition of the death penalty. Richardson, who has been a US ambassador to the United Nations, is well known in the international forums for his work in the pursuit of peace and dialogue among nations, particularly for his negotiations for the release of prisoners and hostages in different countries. The foundation, which will be based in Madrid, will be operational before the end of the year. So I'm happy to announce this new here with you. Those of us who believe that peace is not the mere absence of conflict, but the harmony between people and species, as said before, based on relations of solidarity and justice, will continue to work to get this international body set as soon as possible, as Pope Francis already claimed in his encyclical 5 years ago. We are still on time, but not for much longer. So thank you.
Well, thank you. This is not just a speech. You are making press announcements. You are, we really are becoming productive. If anyone from the panel would like to comment on Jorge's presentation and what this all means, I invite you now. We then move to some questions from the audience. Does anyone want to speak about Professor Roberto's announcements? No. Okay. Then I have a question. How do we get policymakers more involved? How can religious leaders and policymakers work together? It seems we are slipping by each other. There doesn't seem to be a proper meshing of the gears so that things get done, so that the wildlife and the rainforests don't disappear. How do we move to action? Anyone want to take that question? Kieran looks like she's moving forward.
Yeah, sure. I did share one example of how we are working with a local civic body, or the local council, as we call it here in the UK, who make the decisions, who have the budget, who spend the money, and then who are actually tasked to implement certain actions. And I think that the key is, first and foremost, is that shared agenda. So the shared theory that, look, if we don't do something, we're all going to suffer. Be it a policymaker, be it just an ordinary person working in any field, this affects everybody. It's not just bound to any religion, it's just humanity, the whole of humankind, and indeed all of nature and the wildlife. So there are good examples of where it is happening at a local level. These models can be implemented in other areas too. And I think especially as we see the change around us, the policymakers are also keen to work with grassroots communities, with the faith communities in this partnership to ensure that we can make the change that we need to. So I do think it's happening there. And like I have had some questions as well about that, I'm happy to share more details.
Okay. I actually have 3 questions for you, but I can't give you them all. How can we, participating in preventing climate change personally, if you live in a densely populated area, country like India, how do we engage youth? How do you work on a grassroots level if you're living in a big town?
Sure, and India itself, you know, whilst it's densely populated, that's where a lot of the work is actually going on at the moment. We're seeing a lot of good youth leadership coming from India. And so there are grassroots communities coming together in the form of cooperation circles all around India. Young people, people from different communities who are doing things around water, sanitation, planting trees. And like I said, I'm happy to share details of those which may be more local to where the person who's asking the question is, so that we can start to make those connections, you know, and we can start to share those ideas and work together. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's all happening. We just need to join and be part of that force.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a question to Professor Charles, please? In today's or tomorrow's World Environment Day, number 220, they speak about human overgrowth. Now that sounds like fertility control. How does the Catholic Church stand with vis-a-vis fertility control?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. Of course, for the Catholic Church, as you know, the problem is not only overpopulation, but the way the wealth is distributed in our world. So as we could see during this pandemic days and months, we are still continue growing in wealth. But the problem is the concentration of wealth. So if the 1% of the people of the world concentrate more than the half of the wealth that the world has, so the problem here is not the amount of people we have in the world, but the way the wealth is distributed. So I think our challenge, one of the most important challenges for humankind in this moment, is not only the environmental crisis, but as Pope Francis said, is the social crisis, and that means only inequality. That's the real problem of humankind in this time.
Thank you. Thomas, are you able to speak with us? Tom? Can you unmute?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a tough question. This is Thomas Walsh, my co-chair for the faith-based organizations. Do we include, he refers to them as pagan, heathen, indigenous groups, religion? Maybe you want to answer that.
Maybe I could take just a brief minute to just say about the coalition. As you said at the outset, Michael, that we kind of got started in about a year ago. We were in Vienna together, had a series of kind of trial programs at the Crime Commission Conference. And we've kind of built up over the past year with a series of meetings in Vienna and New York and San Francisco. And we were going to be in Kyoto for the UNODC meeting, and but the coronavirus interrupted. So we are inviting faith-based organizations to join this coalition. And so we'd be happy to have other faith-based organizations to write to us. Our email address is CoalitionFBO@gmail.com. And we are building our website, and we'll be in communication with you. We don't have a formal membership at this point, but we're kind of an association of colleagues and friends representing various faith-based organizations and some individuals as well. So we want to be a broad and wide inclusive coalition. Michael, just a minute. It was a great panel. I'm so impressed with this, both as well the UNEP and UNODC, as well as URI, and Professor Sachs and Professor Charles. Excellent presentation.
I agree with you. I don't know about your chair, but I think I wanted to answer that question there, that we do welcome faith-based, and that does not mean religion. We did not use the word religion, we used faith, and that can be Native Americans, it can be indigenous people in Brazil, it can people who care about the earth and perhaps even have a theology that's based on plants and life. So I think we take it very far. Of course, Satanism and other kinds of weird religion groups we would not welcome, but certainly people who believe in nature, almost any form, are welcome to join our federation. Yeah.
You know, I don't want to intervene with the other questions, but it's just I would welcome hearing what any of the panelists might suggest for this coalition, how we might be effective and supportive in your work.
Jorge, do you want to talk about that? Do you think there's any use for us in UNODC?
Of course, Michael. I mean, there's two issues. One is individuals, you know, that group together clearly can have a united voice and as was said earlier, lobby politicians who ultimately are those who run states, who mandate the UN to do its work. Second is you know, this issue affects all, and faith-based organizations, you know, have such a reach, you know, have a membership that the folks I think who are involved in faith-based organizations have a conviction. And when you have a conviction, you know, you really make an effort to make something, to make change. And I think, you know, whether or not it helps the UN, I mean, that's beside the point. I think the idea here is that we all have to work together to save our planet. You know, whether it's whatever part of environmental crime, whether it's, you know, e-waste, dumping, waste dumping, emissions, wildlife, timber, fisheries crime, you know, all of these, we all have to work together, yeah, and have conviction. And I think that's what having a faith helps you do.
Thank you. I just want to make one more advertisement for us. We are going to be dealing with other issues. One of them will be gender justice or prevention of violence against women, particularly during this time of COVID. We will be talking about social injustice, which you referred to. We will be talking about prevention of violence, also run by experts. And we will be talking about treatment of prisoners fairly, perhaps also in the context of COVID violence. So in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time, we are doing this on 3 weeks intervals. Come again, we will be dealing with violence against women, and we will again have some top stars on this. So we're trying to pick up issues that people can feel strongly about and do something about. So yeah, we're growing and we're very happy with this success of this. So thank you again for participating, both the panel and those who are at home. So have a good day and have a good Environment Day tomorrow. Thank you.